Day after day, she shared the little she had with a blind man outside the bookshop, asking nothing in return, until the Duke blocked the doorway, stared her down, and made an accusation that could ruin her life. The morning light filtered through the grimy window of Marina Duarte's small apartment, casting pale rectangles across the worn wooden floor. She moved quietly, her bare feet making no sound as she prepared coffee with water that had been boiled twice to stretch the grounds. The ritual was precise, economical. 2 spoonfuls for herself, none wasted on luxury she couldn't afford. From the narrow bed against the wall came the soft breathing of her son Caio, still lost in whatever dreams 10-year-old boys carried. His school uniform hung on a nail, freshly washed but showing the telltale signs of careful mending. Marina had spent the previous evening reinforcing a seam that threatened to give way, her fingers working by the light of a single bulb while Caio bent over his homework at their small table. She dressed in the same deliberate way she did everything else. A simple dark dress that wouldn't show dirt, comfortable shoes that would last another season if she was careful. Her reflection in the cracked mirror showed a woman of 32 who looked older, not from vanity neglected but from the weight of constant calculation. Every day was mathematics. Rent due in 12 days, groceries that needed to last until Friday, the electric bill that could be delayed one more week if she spoke to Signora Rosa with the right combination of humility and determination. The bookshop key felt familiar in her palm as she locked their door and descended the narrow stairs. The building was old, filled with families like hers who measured sugar by the spoonful and counted coins twice. Children's voices echoed in the courtyard, women hung washing on lines strung between windows, and somewhere an old man coughed with the persistence of someone who couldn't afford to stop working long enough to recover properly. Marina walked the 6 blocks to the bookshop as the city stirred to life around her. Street vendors arranged their wares, shopkeepers swept their storefronts, and delivery trucks rumbled past carrying goods to neighborhoods where people didn't count the cost of bread. She belonged to the early morning economy of necessity, the world that functioned before the comfortable world even opened its eyes. The bookshop stood wedged between a pharmacy and a small café, its narrow frontage marked by a faded sign that read Livros Santos, in letters that had once been gold. Marina had worked here for 3 years, ever since Signora Beatriz had taken pity on a young widow with careful hands and a quiet voice. The job paid barely enough, but it came with dignity. She was surrounded by books, by stories of people who had overcome impossible circumstances, by the quiet hope that lived between pages. The bell above the door chimed softly as she entered, and the familiar smell enveloped her like a worn blanket. Dust and paper, leather bindings and the faint vanilla scent of aging glue. She moved through the narrow aisles with practiced efficiency, straightening spines, dusting shelves, preparing the small space for another day of customers who sought escape or enlightenment or simply a quiet place to exist for a few moments. The morning routine was meditation. Each book returned to its proper place, each surface cleared and cleaned, each corner made ready for whatever the day would bring. Marina found peace in this order, in the way stories arranged themselves by subject and author, in the predictable geography of human knowledge and imagination. Through the window she watched the street come alive. The cafe next door filled with people who could afford to buy their breakfast instead of making it. The pharmacy served a steady stream of customers, their needs urgent and immediate. Between them, the bookshop waited with the patience of something that knew its value couldn't be measured in the same currency. At 9 o'clock she unlocked the front door and turned the sign to Alberto. The day had officially begun, though she had no way of knowing it would be different from all the others that had come before. That today the careful balance she had maintained between survival and dignity would be tested in ways she couldn't imagine. That a stranger would appear who would force her to choose between the safety of invisibility and the dangerous territory of human connection. For now, there was only the quiet bookshop, the morning light slanting through the window, and Marina Duarte standing ready to face whatever came next with the same careful courage that got her through each day. The blind man appeared on a Tuesday, as if he had materialized from the morning mist that clung to the cobblestones. Marina noticed him first as a stillness against the movement of the street, a figure seated with his back against the brick wall beside the bookshop, so motionless he seemed like part of the architecture itself. He was perhaps 50, though hardship had a way of aging faces beyond their years. His clothes were clean but worn thin, the kind of careful poverty that maintained dignity through sheer force of will. A battered hat rested on his knees, not positioned for begging but simply there, like a man who had learned to carry everything he owned. His hands lay folded over it, fingers long and careful, and his head was tilted slightly as if he were listening to something the rest of the world couldn't hear. Marina watched him through the window as she arranged the morning display. He didn't move when people passed, didn't track their footsteps or turn toward voices. The certainty of his blindness was absolute, carved into the stillness of his posture and the particular way he held his head, not looking but listening with an intensity that made the air around him seem thicker. The first customer of the day was Senora Carvalho, who came for her weekly romance novel and always lingered to share neighborhood gossip. She noticed the man immediately, her eyes narrowing with the practiced suspicion of someone who had learned to guard her small comforts against any perceived threat. "There's a vagrant by your door," she announced, setting her coins on the counter with more force than necessary. "You should call someone. It's not proper having such people so close to decent businesses." Marina's hands stilled on the book she was wrapping. Through the window, she could see the man's shoulders, the careful way he breathed, the absolute absence of movement that spoke of someone trying to take up as little space as possible. "He's not bothering anyone." "Not yet," Senora Carvalho replied with the certainty of someone who had never been forced to sleep rough. "But these people, they multiply. First one, then 10. Before you know it, the whole street will be full of them." After the woman left, Marina found herself glancing toward the window more frequently. The man remained exactly as he had been, hands folded, head tilted, listening. When the lunch crowd passed by, their conversations and footsteps creating a river of sound, he never moved to acknowledge them. He existed in parallel to the life of the street, present but separate, like a shadow cast by invisible light. By afternoon, the heat had grown oppressive, and Marina noticed how the man's head had drooped slightly, his shoulders curved inward in a way that spoke of exhaustion held barely in check. She made her decision without conscious thought, the way she had learned to act when thinking too long meant missing the opportunity for kindness. She filled a cup with cool water from the small tap in the back room and walked outside. The man's head lifted as her footsteps approached, and she saw his face clearly for the first time, weathered but dignified, with lines that spoke of laughter as much as hardship. His eyes, clouded white with cataracts, turned toward her voice before she had spoken. "I brought you some water," she said quietly, crouching beside him to place the cup carefully in his hands. "It's very hot today." His fingers closed around the cup with a slight tremor, and she realized it might have been hours since anyone had offered him anything. He drank slowly, carefully, as if the water were something precious that shouldn't be wasted. "Thank you," he said, and his voice was educated, cultured in a way that didn't match his circumstances. Not the rough accent of the streets but something softer, more careful. "You're very kind." Marina stood, brushing dust from her dress. "There's shade around the corner, by the cafe. It might be cooler there." He shook his head with a small smile. "I like the sounds here. The bell when people enter your shop, the way their voices change when they find what they're looking for. Books have a particular sound, don't they? Different from other purchases." She stared at him, surprised by the observation. "You know it's a bookshop? The paper has a smell. And people linger differently when they're choosing stories instead of necessities." He handed the cup back to her, his fingers careful not to brush hers. "Thank you again. For the water and for not asking questions." Marina returned to the shop with the empty cup, but found herself looking out the window every few minutes. The man had settled back into his listening posture, but something about the encounter lingered. Not just his gratitude but the careful way he had spoken, the education that colored his words, the mystery of how someone with such quiet dignity had ended up sleeping against brick walls. As evening approached and she prepared to close the shop, she found herself packing the small sandwich she had brought for her own lunch, adding an apple from the bowl Senora Beatriz kept for customers' children. When she stepped outside to lock the door, the man was still there, and she placed the small package beside him without a word. Walking home through the gathering dusk, Marina felt the weight of what she had begun. In a life measured by careful calculations, she had just added a variable that couldn't be quantified. Tomorrow there would be another cup of water, another small kindness, another choice between the safety of indifference and the risk of caring about a stranger whose story she didn't know and didn't dare to ask. The routine established itself without discussion, like water finding its path down a hillside. Each morning, Marina would unlock the bookshop and find the blind man in his place against the wall, positioned with the same careful precision as if someone had drawn an outline around him. She would bring water first, then later in the day whatever small portion of food she could spare. A piece of bread, leftover soup in a thermos, sometimes fruit that was approaching its last day of freshness. He never asked for anything. Never reached toward her or made demands with his posture or voice. When she approached, he would lift his head slightly, acknowledging her presence with the subtle shift of someone who had learned to read the world through sound and vibration. His thank you came in the same educated tone that puzzled her, always followed by a question or observation that revealed an unexpected depth of attention to the world around him. "The woman who comes for romance novels?" he said one afternoon as Marina crouched beside him with a bowl of broth. "She's lonely, isn't she?" Her voice changes when she talks about the books, becomes softer. Like she's describing something she wishes existed in her real life. Marina nearly dropped the bowl. Senora Carvalho had been coming to the shop for 2 years, always choosing stories about passionate love affairs, always lingering to ask pointed questions about the plots. Marina had noticed the wistfulness in her voice but had never heard it described so precisely by someone who had only listened through a window. "You pay attention," she said quietly. "When you can't see, you learn to hear everything else. The way people's footsteps change when they're happy or sad, how voices carry different weights depending on what someone is carrying inside." He accepted the bowl with both hands, cradling it like something precious. "Your son calls your name differently than other children call their mothers. More careful, like he's afraid of asking for too much." The observation struck her like cold water. Marina's breath caught in her throat because it was true. Caio had learned the same careful economy she practiced, measuring even his requests for attention against what she could afford to give. "How do you know about my son?" "He waited for you yesterday evening. I heard him counting the coins in his pocket, adding them up several times. When you came out, he asked if you could afford ice cream, but in a way that was ready for no as an answer." The man's voice was gentle, without pity. "He's learning to be careful with wanting things." That night, Marina lay awake listening to Caio's breathing in the next bed, thinking about the stranger's words. In trying to protect her son from disappointment, had she taught him to expect too little from the world? The mathematics of their survival had become so natural she hadn't noticed how it was shaping him, making him smaller and more cautious with each passing day. The next morning brought the first real challenge to her new routine. Father Miguel from the church 2 streets over appeared at the bookshop door just as Marina was preparing to take water outside. He was a thin man with kind eyes and the particular brand of concern that came from someone who genuinely cared but had never been hungry himself. "Marina, my child," he said, his voice carrying the gentle authority of someone accustomed to being listened to. "I've been hearing concerns about the situation outside your shop. People are worried that encouraging vagrants might attract more of them to the neighborhood." Marina set down the cup of water but didn't step away from the door. "He's not causing any trouble, Father. He just sits quietly." "I understand your Christian impulse to help," Father Miguel continued, his tone growing more pastoral. "But sometimes kindness without wisdom can create larger problems. There are proper channels for helping the less fortunate. The church operates a soup kitchen twice a week. There are shelters that can provide appropriate care." Through the window, Marina could see the blind man's still form, and she realized that Father Miguel was speaking as if the man couldn't hear them, as if his blindness had made him deaf to judgment as well as invisible to consideration. "He's not asking for anything," she said, her voice quieter but firmer. "I choose to share what little I have. That's also Christian, isn't it?" Father Miguel's expression softened with the particular sadness reserved for well-meaning people who didn't understand the complexities of charity. "Of course, child. But we must consider the broader community. Your kindness is admirable, but it may be creating an environment that makes other people uncomfortable. Sometimes the most loving thing is to encourage people toward proper help instead of enabling them to avoid the resources designed for their situation." After he left, Marina stood holding the cup of water, feeling the weight of community pressure settling around her shoulders like a heavy shawl. Through the window, she could see the blind man's head tilted in her direction, and she realized he had heard every word of the conversation. When she finally stepped outside, he spoke before she could offer the water. "I can find somewhere else," he said quietly. "I don't want to cause you trouble." Marina crouched beside him and placed the cup in his hands. "Where would you go?" He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. "Finally, there are other doorways. Other walls. Some where people don't notice as much. And some where people notice too much in the wrong ways," Marina replied, thinking of the darker streets where kindness was rarer and dangers more common. She stood up, brushing dust from her dress, and made a decision that surprised her with its firmness. "This is a good corner. Safe and quiet. If you want to stay, then stay." As she turned to go back inside, she heard his voice, so soft it might have been meant only for himself. "Thank you." But Marina understood he wasn't thanking her for the water. The change came on a Thursday morning with the sound of expensive leather shoes on cobblestones. Marina noticed it first as a disruption in the usual rhythm of the street. Footsteps that fell with more authority, more intention than the hurried shuffle of working people beginning their day. She looked up from the inventory she was updating to see a man approaching the bookshop with the particular stride of someone accustomed to having space cleared for him. Dante Ashford was tall, perhaps 40, with a kind of precise grooming that spoke of resources applied to appearance. His coat was well-tailored but not ostentatious, his bearing confident without being aggressive. Everything about him suggested careful cultivation, power exercised through presence rather than display. He paused at the bookshop window, not to look at the books but to study the interior with the methodical attention of someone conducting an evaluation. Marina felt her chest tighten. In her experience, men like this didn't appear in neighborhoods like hers without reason, and the reasons were rarely pleasant for people in her position. He entered with the same deliberate pace, the bell above the door sounding different somehow, smaller, more tentative in the presence of his authority. His eyes moved systematically through the small space, cataloging details with the precision of someone trained to notice everything. When his gaze finally settled on Marina, she felt assessed in a way that made her skin prickle. "Good morning," he said, his voice cultured, controlled. "You're Marina Duarte." It wasn't a question. The fact that he knew her name sent cold spreading through her chest. She managed a nod, not trusting her voice to remain steady. "I'm Dante Ashford." He moved deeper into the shop, his presence making the narrow aisles feel even smaller. "I represent certain interests in this neighborhood. Business interests, property development, community welfare." Marina's hands tightened on the inventory list. She had heard whispers of development plans, rumors of old buildings being bought and transformed, of long-time residents finding their rents suddenly unaffordable. The kind of progress that improved neighborhoods by removing the people who had lived in them. "I understand you've been charitable towards someone who spends time near your establishment," Dante continued, his tone conversational but weighted. "A blind man." "I don't see how that concerns anyone else," Marina replied, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. Dante smiled, but it was the controlled expression of someone managing a conversation rather than enjoying it. "Community welfare is everyone's concern, don't you think? When individuals take actions that affect the broader neighborhood, it becomes a matter of collective interest." He moved toward the window, positioning himself where he could see the blind man's usual spot against the wall. "Tell me, what do you know about your friend outside?" "He's not causing any harm." "That's not what I asked." Dante's voice remained pleasant, but something harder moved beneath it. "I asked what you know about him. His name, his background, how he came to be here. Simple questions about someone you've chosen to support." Marina realized with growing unease that she couldn't answer any of those questions. In 3 weeks of daily kindness, she had never asked the blind man's name, never inquired about his circumstances. She had acted from instinct, from the simple recognition of need, without considering what she might be enabling or whom she might be protecting. "He seems educated," she offered finally. "Yes," Dante agreed, turning back to face her. "He does, doesn't he? Interesting vocabulary, careful diction. Not quite what one would expect from someone sleeping rough." He moved closer to the counter where Marina stood. "Doesn't that make you curious? Someone with his evident cultivation, reduced to begging on street corners?" The question hung in the air like smoke, filling the space with implications Marina didn't want to consider. What if the blind man wasn't what he seemed? What if her kindness had been naive, her trust misplaced? What if she had put herself and Kaio at risk through simple failure to ask the right questions? "I should let you return to your work," Dante said, moving toward the door with the same controlled pace. "But I hope you'll think about what we've discussed. Community responsibility. The importance of knowing whom we choose to help." He paused at the threshold. "I may stop by again. Just to check on how things are progressing." After he left, Marina stood frozen behind the counter, her hands shaking slightly as she tried to return to her inventory. The bookshop felt different now, smaller and more exposed, as if invisible walls had been stripped away. Through the window, she could see the blind man in his usual position, and for the first time since she had begun helping him, she felt the sharp edge of fear. Not fear of him, but fear of what her compassion might have set in motion. Fear that in trying to do something good, she had drawn attention she couldn't afford, from people whose interest in her neighborhood wasn't benevolent. Fear that her careful life was about to become much more complicated. The bell chimed as another customer entered, and Marina looked up to see Signora Carvalho approaching with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Did you see him?" she whispered conspiratorially. "The well-dressed man who was just here? I heard he's involved with the new development plans." They say he's been asking questions about people in the neighborhood, about who might be problematic for the kind of improvements they're planning. Marina's stomach dropped as the implications crystallized. She wasn't just being watched, she was being evaluated. And the blind man outside, whether he knew it or not, had become a test of whether she would choose compliance or compassion when pressure was applied. The surveillance began subtly, like morning mist that thickens so gradually you don't notice until the world has become opaque around you. Marina first became aware of it 3 days after Dante Ashford's visit, when she realized the same dark car had been parked across from the bookshop for 2 consecutive mornings. Not directly in front, but positioned with a clear view of the entrance and the corner where the blind man sat. The driver never got out, never made any obvious show of watching, but Marina could feel the weight of observation settling over her routine like dust on books left too long undisturbed. When she brought water to the blind man, she sensed eyes cataloging the interaction. When she offered food, she imagined reports being filed somewhere, her kindness translated into evidence of something more complicated than simple compassion. The blind man noticed too. She could tell from the way his posture changed, becoming even more still, more carefully contained. His head no longer tilted with the relaxed attention of someone listening to the street's natural rhythms. Instead, he held himself with the tension of prey that knows it's being stalked but can't see the predator. "There are new sounds," he said quietly when she crouched beside him with soup on the 4th day. "Different footsteps. People who stand too long in one place, who breathe differently when they're watching instead of just passing through." Marina's hand trembled slightly as she passed him the thermos. "Are you afraid?" He considered the question with the same careful attention he gave everything else. Fear is useful when it makes you careful. Dangerous when it makes you stop living. He accepted the soup with steady hands. "But I worry more about what this attention might mean for you." That afternoon, Dante returned to the bookshop, this time entering with the familiarity of someone who had already established a claim to the space. He moved through the aisles more slowly than before, occasionally pulling a book from the shelf to examine it, playing the role of customer with just enough conviction to make his real purpose deniable. "You have an interesting selection," he said, holding up a volume of poetry. "Neruda. Not what I would have expected in a neighborhood bookshop." Marina continued organizing returns, trying to project normalcy while her pulse hammered against her throat. "Senora Beatriz, the owner, believes people deserve access to beauty regardless of their circumstances." "Noble sentiment," Dante replied, replacing the book with deliberate care. "Though I wonder sometimes if beauty without context becomes mere decoration. Whether people can truly appreciate what they haven't earned through education or experience." The comment was designed to provoke, to test whether Marina would defend her customers or agree with his implied judgment. She chose a third option, silence. Let him interpret her lack of response however he wished. Dante moved to the window, positioning himself where he could observe the blind man while maintaining the pretense of casual browsing. "Your friend seems comfortable here. Almost proprietary in the way he's claimed that particular spot. It's a public street." "Yes, but some people understand the unwritten rules about public spaces better than others." He turned back to Marina, his expression pleasant but his eyes calculating. "Property values in this area are beginning to rise. Development interest is increasing. When that happens, neighborhoods go through adjustments. Some people adapt well to change. Others resist and find themselves left behind." Marina set down the book she was holding, meeting his gaze directly. "Are you threatening me?" Dante's smile was practiced, the expression of someone who had perfected the art of applying pressure without leaving fingerprints. "I'm sharing information about economic realities. Change is coming whether we welcome it or not. The question is whether we position ourselves to benefit from it or find ourselves displaced by it." He moved toward the door, then paused as if struck by an afterthought. I've been curious about something. Your friend outside, how did he know to choose this particular corner? This specific spot outside your shop?" The question landed like cold water. Marina realized she had never wondered about this herself, had accepted the blind man's presence as random chance rather than considered choice. But Dante was right, in a city full of doorways and corners, why this one? "People find their way to where they need to be," she answered finally. "Do they?" Dante's tone suggested he found this explanation insufficient. "Or do they find their way to where they've been before?" After he left, Marina found herself studying the blind man through the window with new eyes. The way he positioned himself wasn't random, it was precise, chosen for maximum comfort and minimum obstruction. He knew which way the wind typically blew, where the afternoon sun would fall, how to avoid the path of delivery trucks. This wasn't the careful mapping of someone new to the streets. This was knowledge born of familiarity. That evening, as she prepared to close the shop, Marina made a decision that had been building since Dante's first visit. Instead of simply leaving food beside the blind man and walking away, she lingered. "How long have you been coming to this corner?" she asked. His head tilted toward her voice, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, with the careful consideration he brought to everything, "Long enough to know that you work late on Thursdays because the inventory needs updating. That you walk home by a different route when you're worried about something. That you count money twice when business has been slow." Marina's breath caught. He had been watching her, or rather listening to her, with the same intensity she had observed in him. All this time, while she thought she was choosing to help a stranger, he had been studying her habits, learning her patterns, becoming familiar with her life in ways that suddenly felt invasive. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Someone who needed help," he replied. "Someone who found it in an unexpected place." It wasn't really an answer, but Marina understood it was all she would get. As she walked home through streets that felt different now, watched, waited with possibility and threat, she realized that her simple act of kindness had become something much more complex. A test, a risk, a choice that would define not just her own future but the future of everyone connected to her small corner of the world. The revelation came wrapped in an ordinary Tuesday morning, delivered through the casual cruelty of neighborhood gossip. Senora Martinez, who cleaned offices in the business district and collected information like other people collected coins, arrived at the bookshop with news that made Marina's carefully ordered world tilt on its axis. "You know that blind man you've been feeding?" Senora Martinez said without preamble, her voice carrying the particular satisfaction of someone delivering shocking news. "My cousin works at the municipal records office. She says his name is Gabriel Santos, and he used to teach literature at the university." Marina's hands stilled on the books she was shelving. "Teach. 20 years," she said. "Had his own office, published papers about poetry and philosophy. Then something happened, some kind of scandal involving a student." "Not what you're thinking," Senora Martinez added quickly, reading Marina's expression. "Money. Accusations about changed grades, falsified transcripts. Never proved, but enough to force his resignation." The information settled over Marina like cold cloth. Gabriel Santos. Professor Gabriel Santos, who recognized the sound of people choosing stories over necessities, who could hear loneliness in a customer's voice and identify the careful mathematics of a child's requests for attention. "The cousin says he lost everything," Senora Martinez continued, warming to her story. "House, pension, savings all went to lawyers trying to clear his name. Wife left him, took their daughter. Then the illness started, something with his eyes, progressive. By the time he was cleared of the charges, he was blind and had nowhere to go." Marina felt the weight of understanding settling in her chest. The educated voice, the careful observations about literature and human nature, the way he positioned himself outside a bookshop rather than any other establishment, it all made sense now. He hadn't chosen her corner randomly. He had chosen the place where books lived, where stories were sold and dreams were housed in paper and ink. 5 years ago this was, Senora Martinez concluded. 5 years sleeping rough because he was too proud to ask for help and too broken to start over. After Senora Martinez left, Marina found herself unable to concentrate on her work. Through the window, she could see Gabriel in his usual position, head tilted in the listening posture that had become so familiar. But now she understood what he was listening for, not just the sounds of the street, but perhaps the ghost of his former life, the echo of classrooms where he had once discussed the very books that surrounded her now. The knowledge changed everything and nothing. He was still the man who had needed help, who had accepted her kindness with dignity and gratitude. But he was also someone who had fallen from a height she had never imagined, someone whose loss was measured not just in comfort but in identity, purpose, the fundamental understanding of who he was in the world. When she brought him soup that afternoon, Gabriel seemed to sense the shift in her demeanor. "You know," he said quietly, accepting the container with steady hands. "Why didn't you tell me?" He was quiet for a long time and Marina thought he might not answer. Finally, "What would you have done differently? Would you have brought different soup? Better bread?" "I might have. Treated me like a former professor instead of a man who needed help?" His voice was gentle but pointed. "Spoken to me about books instead of simply being kind? Made my loss the center of every interaction instead of letting me exist as I am now?" Marina realized he was right. Knowing his history would have changed their dynamic, made her conscious of the gap between what he had been and what he had become. Her instinctive kindness would have been complicated by pity. Her natural interaction weighted with the knowledge of his fall. I chose this corner because books were the center of my life for 40 years, Gabriel continued. Not because I hoped to reclaim that life, but because I wanted to remain near something that had meant everything to me. Your kindness let me do that without having to explain or justify or perform the role of the tragic former academic. That evening, as Marina walked home through streets that felt increasingly unstable under her feet, she carried the weight of complete understanding. Gabriel wasn't just a man who had needed help, he was a man whose entire identity had been stripped away by circumstances beyond his control. Someone who had learned that the distance between security and destitution could be crossed in a single step, a single accusation, a single moment when the world decided you were no longer useful. She thought about Dante Ashford's questions, his obvious suspicion that Gabriel was more than he appeared. In one sense, Dante had been right. Gabriel was educated, cultured, carrying knowledge that didn't match his circumstances. But that made him more deserving of compassion, not less. His fall had been further than most people could imagine, his reconstruction of dignity from nothing more impressive than any simple survival. At home, as she helped Caio with homework that involved reading comprehension and vocabulary words, Marina found herself thinking about the man outside the bookshop who had once taught these same skills to university students. Who had probably assigned papers on the very authors whose books he now listened to being sold through a window. Who had lost not just his livelihood but his ability to see the printed word that had been his life's passion. "Mama," Caio said looking up from his worksheet, "you seem sad tonight." Marina smoothed his hair, feeling the weight of all the adult complications he was too young to understand. Sometimes grown-ups have to think about difficult things. Is it about money again? The question pierced her because of its careful neutrality, the way he asked without hope or expectation, already prepared for her to carry whatever burden was troubling her alone. She realized that in trying to protect him from their financial struggles, she had taught him to expect exclusion from her concerns, to accept that worry was her solitary responsibility. Not just money, she said carefully. Sometimes about how to help people, and whether helping them might bring trouble we're not ready for. Caio nodded with the solemn understanding of a child who had learned early that kindness was a luxury that had to be weighed against survival. "But you help anyway." "Yes," Marina said, knowing it was both promise and commitment. "I help anyway." The inspection came without warning on a gray Friday morning, announced by the sharp knock of someone accustomed to having doors opened immediately. Marina looked up from the poetry section she was reorganizing to see two men in municipal uniforms standing at the bookshop entrance, their presence transforming the small space from sanctuary to interrogation room. "Health and safety inspection," the older man announced, producing a clipboard with the authority of paperwork. "Routine check. We'll need to examine the premises." Marina's stomach clenched. In 3 years of working at the bookshop, there had never been an inspection. The timing, so soon after Dante's visits, felt deliberate as a slap. She moved aside as the men entered, their boots heavy on the old wooden floors, their eyes already cataloging potential violations. They worked with methodical efficiency, testing the stability of shelves, examining electrical outlets, measuring the width of aisles. The older inspector made notes on his clipboard while the younger one photographed everything: the narrow passages between bookcases, the small sink in the back room, the uneven floorboards that had settled with the building's age. "Fire safety concerns," the older man muttered, pointing to the way books were stacked near the small heater. "Exit obstruction," he added, noting how the poetry section narrowed the path to the back door. Every normal aspect of the bookshop's layout was reframed as a potential hazard, every sign of age transformed into evidence of negligence. Marina stood silently, understanding that protest would only provide additional reasons to find fault. She watched them measure, photograph, and document, knowing that each notation on the clipboard represented another threat to the small stability she had built. Through the window, she could see Gabriel in his usual position, but his posture had changed. His head was no longer tilted in relaxed attention but held with the alertness of someone sensing danger. He couldn't see the inspection, but he could hear it, the authoritative voices, the movement of heavy boots, the particular sound of official business being conducted. "Water damage," the younger inspector observed, pointing to a small stain on the ceiling where rain had leaked through the old roof. "Potential mold hazard." "Structural concerns," his partner added, pressing against a wall that gave slightly under pressure. Marina realized they weren't just inspecting, they were building a case. Each observation was another piece of evidence that could be used to declare the bookshop unsafe, unsuitable for public use. The inspection was a weapon disguised as routine procedure. "We'll need to speak with the owner," the older man announced. "These issues require immediate attention. Until proper repairs are made and re-inspection completed, there may be grounds for temporary closure." "Senora Beatriz is visiting family in the countryside," Marina managed. "She won't return for 2 weeks. Then she'll need to be contacted immediately." He handed her a formal notice printed on municipal letterhead. "These violations must be addressed within 30 days, or the premises will be subject to closure pending compliance." After they left, Marina stood in the suddenly quiet bookshop, reading the official language that reduced her workplace to a list of hazards and deficiencies. The repairs would cost more than Senora Beatriz earned in 6 months. The bureaucratic process of appeals and re-inspections could drag on indefinitely. Even if they found the money for fixes, there would always be another inspection, another set of violations, another official reason why this small bookshop posed an unacceptable risk to public safety. She walked to the window and looked out at Gabriel, who seemed to sense her gaze and turned his head toward the glass. For a moment, she considered walking outside and telling him everything, about the inspection, about Dante's interest, about the way her simple kindness had apparently triggered a campaign to remove both of them from this corner of the city. Instead, she opened the bookshop door and stepped outside, carrying a cup of water as she had every day for weeks. Gabriel's hands were steadier than hers as he accepted it. "Trouble?" he said quietly. It wasn't a question. "Yes. Because of me." Marina looked down at his upturned face, seeing clearly for the first time the intelligence that had made him a professor, the dignity that had survived 5 years of loss, the quiet strength that had never asked her for anything more than she chose to give. "Because I chose to help," she corrected. "Because some people believe kindness is a privilege that should be rationed according to their judgment." Gabriel drank the water slowly, and when he handed back the empty cup, his fingers brushed hers briefly. "I can disappear," he said. "Find another corner, another doorway. Remove the problem they're using against you." Marina felt something crystallize inside her chest, a clarity that cut through all the fear and uncertainty of the past weeks. "The problem isn't you being here. The problem is a world that considers compassion a violation worth punishing." She stood, brushing dust from her dress, and looked down the street where the dark car sat in its usual observation post. Let them watch. Let them document her defiance. Let them turn her kindness into evidence of whatever crime they needed to justify their actions. "I'll be here tomorrow," she said, more to herself than to Gabriel. "And I'll bring water." As she turned to go back inside, she heard his voice, so soft it might have been carried on the wind. "Thank you." But Marina understood he wasn't thanking her for the water or even for the promise of tomorrow. He was thanking her for refusing to let fear transform compassion into complicity, for choosing to remain human in a world increasingly determined to make humanity a luxury only the powerful could afford. The confrontation came on the kind of morning when the city felt brittle, as if the wrong word or gesture might crack something fundamental. Marina unlocked the bookshop to find Dante Ashford already waiting, positioned with the same deliberate precision she had noticed before. But this time his presence carried a different energy, not the evaluative patience of their earlier encounters, but the focused intensity of someone ready to close a negotiation. "Good morning, Marina," he said, entering behind her without invitation. "I think it's time we had a more direct conversation." She moved through the familiar routine of opening lights, register, straightening displays, while he positioned himself near the window where Gabriel would soon appear. The morning felt charged with the electricity that precedes thunderstorms, heavy with the weight of words not yet spoken. "The inspection report makes for interesting reading," Dante continued, producing a folder from inside his coat. "Quite extensive list of violations. Fire hazards, structural deficiencies, health concerns. The kind of problems that typically require immediate remediation or temporary closure." Marina's hands stilled on the books she was arranging. "Those men worked for you. They work for the city. I simply ensured they were thorough in their evaluation." Dante opened the folder, scanning pages as if reviewing evidence. 23 distinct violations, some classified as serious safety risks. Senora Beatriz will find herself facing substantial fines and mandatory repairs that could easily exceed the property's annual income. Through the window, Marina saw Gabriel settling into his usual position, unaware that this morning would be different from all the others. She felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. "What do you want?" Dante smiled, but it was the expression of someone who had been waiting for exactly this question. "I want to help you understand that your situation has become untenable. The bookshop faces closure unless significant investments are made, investments Senora Beatriz cannot afford. Your employment here will end within weeks, leaving you without income to support yourself and your son. He moved closer to the counter, his presence filling the small space. But these problems could be resolved if certain adjustments were made to the neighborhood dynamic. You want me to stop helping Gabriel? I want you to encourage your friend to find somewhere else to conduct his business. There are shelters, social services, proper channels for people in his situation. Your misguided charity has enabled him to avoid using appropriate resources. Marina felt anger rising in her chest like heat from a flame. His business? He sits quietly and bothers no one. He sits in a location that discourages investment, that sends the wrong message about neighborhood stability. Property values are beginning to rise, but progress requires the removal of elements that signal decay or social dysfunction. Dante's voice remained calm, reasonable, as if he were explaining basic mathematics. One man's comfort cannot be allowed to compromise an entire community's economic development. And if I refuse? Dante closed the folder with deliberate care. Then you'll discover how quickly circumstances can deteriorate for someone in your position. The bookshop will close, you'll lose your employment, and your son will grow up watching his mother's stubborn pride prevent her from making practical choices that could have secured his future. The threat hung in the air between them, precise and devastating. Marina understood that this was no longer about Gabriel's presence or her acts of kindness. This was about power, about who had the right to exist in spaces deemed valuable by people who measured worth in profit margins and development potential. "You're afraid," she said suddenly, the realization surprising her with its clarity. Dante's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Excuse me? You're afraid that if people see one woman choosing compassion over compliance, others might make the same choice. That kindness might be contagious in ways that complicate your plans." For the first time since their encounters began, Dante's composure shifted. Not dramatically, but enough to reveal something harder beneath his cultivated reasonableness. "I'm being practical about economic realities. You're being sentimental about situations you don't fully understand. I understand that you need me to stop helping Gabriel because my refusal to do so threatens something larger than one corner or one bookshop." Marina felt her own voice growing steadier, stronger. "I understand that you can't force me directly, so you're using threats against my livelihood and my son's security to make me choose compliance voluntarily." Dante straightened, his professional mask sliding back into place. "I'm offering you an opportunity to make a reasonable choice before circumstances make that choice for you. Consider your son's future, Marina. Consider what your pride is really worth when measured against his opportunities for education, security, a better life." He moved toward the door, then turned back with an expression of carefully manufactured concern. "You have until Monday to demonstrate that you've made the practical choice. After that, the municipal violations will proceed through normal channels, and other agencies may find reasons to examine your suitability as a guardian for a minor child." The words hit Marina like physical blows. Threatening her job was one thing, but threatening Caio's security crossed a line that made her vision blur with rage and fear. She gripped the edge of the counter to keep herself steady. "You would take my son? I would document concerns about a parent whose judgment appears compromised, whose choices consistently prioritize strangers over her own child's welfare. Social services take such documentation very seriously, especially when combined with evidence of economic instability and association with vagrant populations." After he left, Marina stood frozen behind the counter, feeling the walls of her carefully constructed life closing in around her. Through the window, she could see Gabriel in the morning light, his presence suddenly transformed from simple human need into the catalyst that might destroy everything she had built to protect her son. The mathematics were brutal and clear. Gabriel's comfort measured against Caio's security, her principles weighed against her child's future. For the first time since this began, Marina understood why most people chose compliance over compassion when the stakes became personal. The weekend passed like a fever dream, hours measured not by the clock but by the weight of impossible choices pressing down on Marina's chest. She found herself watching Caio with desperate attention, memorizing the way he concentrated on his homework, the careful way he counted his pocket money, the trust in his eyes when he asked about their plans for the following week. Saturday evening, she attempted normalcy by cooking his favorite meal, rice with beans and a small piece of chicken she had splurged on despite their budget. But even this simple pleasure felt shadowed by Dante's threats. How many more meals like this would she be able to provide? How long before Caio noticed the fear she was trying so hard to hide? "Mama," he said looking up from his plate, "you keep staring at me. Do I have food on my face?" Marina forced a smile that felt like wearing a mask. "Just thinking about how much you've grown this year. You're becoming such a responsible young man." Kaio's expression grew serious in the way children's faces do when they sense adult concerns they can't quite identify. "Are you worried about money again?" The question pierced her because it revealed how carefully he had learned to read her moods, how attuned he had become to the financial anxieties that colored their daily life. At 9 years old, he shouldn't need to monitor his mother's stress levels or prepare himself for news about things they couldn't afford. "Sometimes adults worry about many things at once," she said carefully. "But that's not your responsibility. Your job is to be a child and let me handle the grown-up problems." "But what if the grown-up problems are too big for just you?" The innocent question contained more wisdom than Marina was prepared to confront. What if the problems were too big? What if her determination to maintain their small stability was actually the thing that would destroy it? Sunday morning found her walking through the neighborhood with unusual attention, seeing it as Dante might see it, the cracked sidewalks, the buildings with peeling paint, the small businesses struggling to survive in an economy that measured value only in potential for transformation. She passed other corners where homeless people had made their temporary homes, noticed how they made themselves as invisible as possible, understanding instinctively that visibility invited trouble. Why had Gabriel chosen her corner? Why had she been the one to offer water that first day? The questions followed her home, where she found Kaio reading one of the books she had borrowed from the shop, a collection of folk tales about ordinary people who faced impossible choices. Heroes who sacrificed everything to save their communities, mothers who gave up their children to protect them from greater dangers, individuals who discovered that sometimes love meant letting go. Monday morning arrived with the cruel brightness of a day that demanded decisions. Marina opened the bookshop with mechanical precision, her hands moving through familiar routines while her mind calculated and recalculated the mathematics of survival. Gabriel would appear soon, would settle into his usual position, would become once again the visible symbol of her choice between compassion and compliance. The first customer was Senora Carvalho, who entered with the particular energy of someone carrying news they were eager to share. "I heard about the inspection," she said without preamble. "Terrible shame about all those violations. But perhaps it's for the best. This neighborhood is changing, property values are rising. Maybe it's time for everyone to adapt to new realities." Marina continued sorting through returns, not trusting herself to respond without revealing the anger burning in her chest. "Of course," Senora Carvalho continued, "I also heard about your situation with the vagrant outside. People are saying you might need to make some difficult choices about community responsibility versus personal sentiment." The way she said personal sentiment made it clear she considered Marina's kindness a weakness rather than a virtue, a luxury the neighborhood could no longer afford in the face of economic progress. "Sometimes," Senora Carvalho concluded, her voice taking on a tone of false sympathy, "the most loving thing we can do is encourage people to seek help through proper channels. Enable them to find resources instead of enabling them to avoid the services designed for their situation." After she left with her weekly romance novel, Marina stood alone in the bookshop, surrounded by stories about people who had faced impossible choices and somehow found ways to honor both their principles and their responsibilities. But those were stories. In real life, the mathematics were simpler and more brutal. Through the window, she saw Gabriel settling into his position against the wall. He moved with the same careful precision as always, but something in his posture suggested he knew this morning was different, that whatever had been building around them was about to reach its conclusion. Marina picked up the cup she had filled with water, held it in hands that trembled slightly, and realized she was about to discover what kind of person she really was when everything she valued was at stake. The choice was no longer theoretical. It was immediate, concrete, measured in the weight of a cup of water and the distance between her door and the corner where compassion met consequence. Marina stood at the bookshop door with the cup of water in her hands, feeling the weight of every eye that might be watching. The dark car sat in its usual position across the street. Gabriel waited against the wall with the patient stillness of someone who had learned not to expect certainty from the world. And somewhere in the machinery of municipal bureaucracy, paperwork was being prepared that would determine whether her small act of daily kindness was worth the destruction of everything else she had built. She stepped outside. The morning air felt different against her skin, charged with the significance of the moment. Each step toward Gabriel carried the weight of deliberate choice, of refusing to let fear transform her into someone she couldn't recognize in the mirror. When she reached him and crouched down to offer the water, His hands were steady as they accepted it, but she noticed the subtle tension around his eyes, the way he held himself like someone braced for bad news. "They've given you an ultimatum," he said quietly. "Yes." Gabriel drank slowly as if savoring what might be their last shared ritual. When he handed back the empty cup, his fingers lingered for a moment against hers. "I won't ask what you've decided. But I need you to know that whatever choice you make, I understand it. Completely." Marina looked down at his upturned face, seeing in it all the dignity that 5 years of loss hadn't been able to erode. "I need you to know something too. This was never about you being deserving or undeserving of help. It was about me choosing who I wanted to be in the world. And now I discover whether choosing to be kind is worth what it costs." As she stood to return to the bookshop, a voice called her name from across the street. Dante Ashford was approaching, his expression unreadable but his pace deliberate. Marina felt her pulse accelerate, knowing that this public encounter was designed to force her choice into the open, to make her defiance or compliance visible to anyone who might be watching. "Good morning, Marina," Dante said, positioning himself where he could see both her and Gabriel. "I hope you've had time to consider our conversation." "I have. And?" Marina looked at the cup still in her hands, then at Gabriel, who sat listening with the careful attention he brought to everything. She thought about Caio, getting ready for school at this moment, trusting that his mother would continue to provide the stability he needed. She thought about Senora Beatriz, whose bookshop might close because of Marina's choices. She thought about the dozens of people who depended on this small corner of the city remaining affordable, accessible, unchanged. "I'll continue to bring water," she said quietly, "and food when I can spare it." Dante's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air around them. "I see. And you understand the consequences of that choice." "I understand that some consequences are worth accepting. Even when they affect your son?" The question was designed to break her resolve, to make her face the full weight of what her principles might cost. Marina felt the sharp edge of fear slice through her chest, but also something harder, clearer. "Especially then," she said. "Because the most important thing I can teach him is that kindness isn't conditional on convenience. That we don't abandon our humanity when it becomes inconvenient or expensive." Dante nodded slowly as if her response confirmed something he had already suspected. "Very well. You've made your choice with full knowledge of the likely outcomes. I respect that even if I disagree with the wisdom of it." He turned to walk away, then paused and looked back. "For what it's worth, I hope you're right. I hope the cost of your principles turns out to be something you can afford to pay." After he left, Marina stood on the sidewalk feeling simultaneously lighter and heavier than she had in weeks. The choice was made, the die cast. Whatever came next, job loss, financial ruin, threats to her custody of Caio, she would face it as someone who had refused to let fear make her cruel. Gabriel's voice reached her from his position against the wall. "The boy you're protecting by making this choice, he's fortunate to have a mother who understands the difference between safety and dignity." Marina looked down at him, this man whose presence had somehow become the catalyst for discovering what she was truly made of. "We're all just trying to remain human in a world that makes it difficult." As she walked back toward the bookshop, she noticed that the dark car was no longer in its usual observation post. Whether that meant the surveillance was ending or simply changing form, she couldn't know. But for the first time in weeks, Marina felt like herself again, frightened but whole, uncertain but uncompromised. The bell chimed as she entered the bookshop, and she began the day's work with hands that no longer trembled. Whatever consequences awaited her choice, she would meet them as someone who had chosen compassion over compliance, humanity over convenience. The first customer of the day was an elderly man looking for a book of poems to give his granddaughter. As Marina helped him find something appropriate, she realized that this simple transaction, connecting people with stories, facilitating the small moments of beauty that made life bearable, was exactly what she was fighting to preserve. Not just the bookshop or Gabriel's right to exist on a public corner, but the entire ecosystem of small kindnesses that made neighborhoods into communities, that transformed collections of buildings into places where people could afford to be human. The retaliation began within hours, swift and systematic as a military operation. Marina first noticed it when the delivery truck that brought new inventory failed to arrive at its scheduled time. A phone call revealed that their account had been flagged for credit review, and all shipments suspended pending financial verification. When she called the bank to inquire about the hold on the bookshop's account, she was transferred 3 times before reaching someone who could only say that irregularities required additional documentation. By midday, the building inspector had returned with a different partner, this time accompanied by a fire marshal who examined the small space with the intensity of someone expecting to find evidence of arson. They measured doorways twice, tested smoke detectors that had worked perfectly the day before, and discovered new violations that hadn't existed during the previous inspection. Immediate occupancy restrictions, the fire marshal announced, posting an official notice on the door. Maximum capacity reduced to 8 persons pending installation of additional safety equipment. Marina looked around the bookshop, which had never housed more than 4 or 5 customers at any given time, and understood that the restriction wasn't about safety. It was about creating legal justification for harassment, for making normal business operations impossible through bureaucratic strangulation. The third blow came in the form of a letter delivered by courier, an official notice from the city's licensing department questioning the bookshop's compliance with retail regulations. Apparently, someone had filed complaints about inappropriate use of public sidewalk space and failure to maintain proper business boundaries. The letter demanded immediate response to 12 pages of technical questions about inventory management, customer traffic patterns, and sidewalk maintenance responsibilities. Each document required responses within impossibly short time frames, each bureaucratic demand designed to consume time and energy Marina didn't have while generating fees she couldn't afford. The message was clear: compliance with one demand would trigger 2 more, creating an endless cycle of administrative warfare that would eventually exhaust her resources and force submission. That afternoon, as Marina sat surrounded by forms and regulations that seemed designed by someone who had never actually run a small business, the bookshop bell chimed and Señora Beatriz entered unexpectedly. The owner of the bookshop looked older than when she had left for her family visit 2 weeks earlier, her face carrying the weight of someone who had spent the journey home receiving phone calls about inspections, violations, and bureaucratic emergencies. She surveyed the official notices posted on her walls with the expression of someone watching her life's work being dissected by strangers. "They called me this morning," she said quietly. "The bank, the suppliers, the licensing department. 30 years I've run this shop without a single serious problem, and suddenly I'm a public menace requiring immediate intervention." Marina started to speak, to explain about Gabriel and Dante and the impossible choice she had been forced to make, but Señora Beatriz raised a hand to stop her. "I know why this is happening," the older woman said. "Señora Martinez told me about the man you've been helping, about the pressure you've been under to abandon him. She also told me what you chose when they forced you to decide." Marina felt her throat tighten with the weight of anticipated disappointment, of losing not just her job but the respect of someone she had come to admire. "I'm sorry. I know my choices have put your business at risk." Señora Beatriz moved through the small space, running her fingers along book spines with the familiarity of someone who had touched each volume hundreds of times. "Do you know why I opened this bookshop?" Marina shook her head. "Because I believe that everyone deserves access to beauty, to stories, to the idea that their lives can contain more than just survival." Señora Beatriz picked up a volume of poetry, the same Neruda collection Dante had examined weeks earlier. "I believe that kindness shouldn't be a luxury available only to people who can afford it." She turned to face Marina directly. "If I fire you to appease the people who are doing this, what happens to that belief? If I sacrifice your job to save my business, how do I face myself in the mirror each morning?" Marina stared at her employer, not daring to hope she was hearing what she thought she was hearing. "They want us to abandon our humanity to preserve our security," Señora Beatriz continued. "They want to prove that everyone has a price, that principles are luxuries people will surrender when enough pressure is applied." She smiled, and for the first time in weeks, it reached her eyes. "I think it's time we disappointed them." That evening, as Marina prepared to leave the besieged bookshop, she found Gabriel in his usual position but noticed something different in his posture. He wasn't simply waiting or listening, he was actively alert, head tilted not toward the street sounds but toward the bookshop itself. "The older woman who came today," he said as Marina approached with the day's offering of water and bread. "She has the voice of someone who's made a decision that will cost her everything. She's choosing to stand with me. With us." Gabriel accepted the food with careful hands. "People like that, people who choose principle over survival, they're either very wise or very foolish. History usually decides which." As Marina walked home through streets that felt increasingly hostile, she realized that she and Señora Beatriz had crossed a line from which there might be no return. They were no longer simply trying to preserve the status quo, they were actively resisting forces that had the power to destroy everything they had built. But for the first time since this began, Marina didn't feel alone in her defiance. The choice that had seemed impossibly isolating now connected her to someone else who understood that some things were worth defending regardless of cost. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The community response came in waves, each more unexpected than the last. It began with small gestures, customers who lingered longer than necessary, buying books they didn't need but paying for them with deliberate ceremony. Senora Rodriguez, who cleaned houses in the wealthy neighborhoods, arrived with information whispered between employers. They're planning something bigger. More inspections, more pressure. But they're also worried about attention. Word spread through the invisible networks that connected the neighborhood's working people. The cleaners who overheard conversations in executive offices, the delivery drivers who saw which buildings were being surveyed for development, the shop owners who noticed which businesses were suddenly facing unprecedented regulatory scrutiny. By Wednesday, Marina noticed changes in the rhythm of foot traffic around the bookshop. People walked more slowly past the window, their eyes taking in Gabriel's presence with new awareness. Some nodded to him respectfully. Others paused to drop coins into the small container Marina had never seen before but which had somehow appeared beside his usual position. The first direct show of support came from an unlikely source. Padre Miguel from the neighborhood church appeared Thursday morning carrying a folding chair and a thermos of coffee. He positioned the chair a respectful distance from Gabriel and settled in with the apparent intention of remaining indefinitely. "Good morning, brother," he said to Gabriel, his voice carrying the easy familiarity of someone comfortable with people society had rendered invisible. "I thought you might appreciate some company." Gabriel's head turned toward the priest with surprise and something that might have been gratitude. "Father. Just Miguel today. I'm not here in any official capacity." The priest opened his thermos and poured coffee into a second cup he produced from his coat. "I'm here because I believe public spaces belong to the public, not just to people who can afford to purchase comfort." Marina watched from the bookshop window as the two men settled into quiet conversation, Gabriel's careful posture relaxing slightly in the presence of someone who treated his dignity as a given rather than something requiring justification. By afternoon, Padre Miguel had been joined by Dona Rosa, an elderly woman who brought her knitting and positioned herself on Gabriel's other side with the determination of someone claiming territory. When a passing businessman looked at the small gathering with obvious disapproval, she stared back with the fearlessness of someone who had raised 8 children and buried 3 husbands. "Public sidewalk," she announced loudly enough for him to hear. "Public means everyone." Friday brought reinforcements Marina hadn't expected. Students from the university where Gabriel had once taught began appearing, carrying books and backpacks, settling against the building wall as if it were the most natural thing in the world. They didn't speak directly to Gabriel, but their presence created a barrier of youth and academic legitimacy around him. One of them, a young woman with intense eyes and worn shoes, approached Marina in the bookshop that afternoon. "Professor Santos changed my life," she said without preamble. "His classes on social poetry, on literature as resistance, they taught me that words could be weapons against injustice. When I heard he was here, that people were trying to force him away." She gestured toward the window where Gabriel sat surrounded by an impromptu community of supporters. "We couldn't let that happen." Marina felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. "How did you know?" "University networks. Word travels fast when someone we respect is in danger." The student pulled a book from her backpack, a collection of essays about literature and social justice. "He signed this for me 3 years ago before everything happened. I kept it because his inscription said something I needed to remember. The measure of a society is how it treats those who have nothing left to lose." That evening, as Marina prepared to close the bookshop, she counted more than a dozen people maintaining quiet vigil on the sidewalk around Gabriel. They had brought chairs, blankets, books, and the kind of patient determination that suggested they were prepared to remain as long as necessary. Dante Ashford appeared as she was turning off the lights, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the scene outside. For the first time since their encounters began, he looked uncertain, like someone whose careful calculations had failed to account for an unexpected variable. "This is unfortunate," he said, entering the bookshop without his usual assumption of welcome. "You've turned a simple administrative matter into some kind of political demonstration." Marina faced him across the counter, feeling the weight of community support outside like armor around her shoulders. "I gave water to a thirsty man. Everything else has been your choice." "My choice?" Dante's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly. "My choice to try to help this neighborhood develop economically? To create opportunities for property values to rise so that everyone benefits from improvement. Your choice to decide that one man's existence was incompatible with your vision of progress. Your choice to use bureaucratic violence against people who couldn't fight back. Marina gestured toward the window. But it turns out they could fight back. Just not in ways you anticipated. Dante looked out at the quiet gathering on the sidewalk, students reading by streetlight, elderly residents sharing food, Padre Miguel leading what appeared to be an impromptu prayer circle. This won't last. People have jobs, responsibilities. Eventually they'll get tired of playing activist and return to their normal lives. Maybe, Marina agreed. Or maybe they'll discover that defending their community is part of their normal life. That being human requires more than just surviving. As Dante left, Marina realized that something fundamental had shifted. What had begun as her isolated choice between compassion and compliance had become something larger, a neighborhood's decision about what kind of place they wanted to live in, what values they were willing to defend, what they owed to each other beyond mere coexistence. Through the window, she could see Gabriel at the center of the small gathering, his posture more relaxed than she had ever observed. For the first time in weeks, he looked less like someone enduring exile and more like someone who belonged exactly where he was. The escalation came with the weekend, swift and overwhelming as a storm system that had been building pressure just beyond the horizon. Saturday morning brought 3 police cars, an ambulance, and a team of municipal workers carrying clipboards and measuring equipment. The small community that had formed around Gabriel scattered like birds at the first sight of official vehicles, leaving only Padre Miguel, who remained seated with the stubborn dignity of someone who had faced authority before and survived. Marina arrived at the bookshop to find Gabriel being questioned by 2 officers while a third photographed his few possessions. The sight of him sitting quietly under official scrutiny, answering questions with careful politeness while uniformed men decided his fate, sent rage coursing through her veins like poison. "What's happening?" she demanded, approaching the nearest officer. "Routine wellness check," he replied without looking at her. Concerns were raised about an individual potentially suffering from mental health issues, living in unsafe conditions. Marina stared at Gabriel, who appeared more alert and coherent than half the city's elected officials, and understood the cynical genius of the strategy. By framing removal as concern for Gabriel's welfare, they transformed eviction into rescue, made resistance appear cruel rather than compassionate. "He's not mentally ill," she said. "He's homeless, but he's completely rational and capable of making his own decisions." The officer finally looked at her with the tired patience of someone who had heard similar protests before. "Ma'am, that determination isn't yours to make. We have reports of an individual who may pose a danger to himself or others, who's been accepting food and money from strangers, who appears unable to care for himself adequately. Accepting help isn't evidence of incompetence. Consistently remaining in one location, refusing to utilize available social services, declining offers of proper shelter, these can indicate compromised judgment requiring professional evaluation." Marina realized they had weaponized every act of kindness Gabriel had received, transformed each gesture of community support into evidence of his inability to function independently. By helping him, she and the others had inadvertently provided ammunition for those who wanted him removed. The ambulance crew approached with a stretcher and the kind of gentle authority used for people whose cooperation was preferred but not required. Gabriel looked up at Marina with an expression that carried no surprise, only a weary acceptance of how these scenes typically ended. 72-hour evaluation, one of the paramedics explained to her. Standard procedure for wellness checks when someone appears unable to care for themselves safely. And after 72 hours? Depends on the evaluation results. If he's determined competent, he'll be released with information about appropriate services. If not, the paramedic shrugged, leaving the alternative unstated. Marina watched as they helped Gabriel onto the stretcher with careful professionalism, treating him with more dignity and removal than he had received in weeks of bureaucratic harassment. But dignity didn't change the fundamental reality. He was being taken away and there was nothing she could do to prevent it. As the ambulance pulled away, Padre Miguel approached with the grim expression of someone who had witnessed this particular tragedy multiple times before. "They'll keep him the full 72 hours regardless of his mental state," he said quietly. "Then they'll release him with a list of shelters and social services, most of which have waiting lists longer than the life expectancy of people in his situation. But he'll be back? Maybe. Or maybe they'll find reasons to extend the evaluation. Or maybe the experience will break something in him that prison and poverty couldn't touch." The priest looked at the empty corner where Gabriel had maintained his quiet presence for months. "They understand that the cruelest weapon against hope isn't violence, its bureaucracy disguised as compassion. That afternoon brought the next phase of the assault. City workers arrived with equipment to install new sidewalk fixtures, benches with armrests positioned at intervals that made lying down impossible, decorative planters that eliminated spaces where someone might sit for extended periods. The improvements were announced as pedestrian comfort enhancements, but Marina recognized them as defensive architecture, designed to make public spaces hostile to anyone seeking more than momentary rest. By evening, the corner had been transformed. Where Gabriel had sat for months, a new bench offered seating for exactly 2 people, with metal dividers ensuring they couldn't stretch out or get too comfortable. The surrounding area sparkled with fresh paint and strategic landscaping that eliminated every nook or shadow where someone might find shelter. The message was clear. This space now belonged to people who used it temporarily and appropriately, not to those who might need it for survival. Sunday morning, Marina opened the bookshop to find a letter slipped under the door, official municipal stationery announcing that the building's occupancy permit had been suspended pending resolution of outstanding violations. Effective immediately, the bookshop was closed to public access until all regulatory issues were resolved. She stood in the suddenly quiet space, surrounded by thousands of books that no one would be allowed to purchase, and understood that Gabriel's removal had been only the first objective. The real target had always been the entire ecosystem of small kindnesses and stubborn resistance that his presence had catalyzed. They had won by making compassion itself evidence of dysfunction, by transforming community support into proof of incompetence, by demonstrating that caring for others was a luxury society couldn't afford when progress required efficiency. Marina looked out at the empty corner, its newly sanitized perfection gleaming in the morning light, and realized she was staring at the future they had planned all along, a neighborhood safe from the inconvenient humanity of people who needed more than the system was prepared to provide. The question now was whether that future was inevitable, or whether the community that had briefly formed around Gabriel's quiet presence had learned something about resistance that couldn't be sanitized away with fresh paint and strategic architecture. The silence that followed Gabriel's removal felt different from ordinary quiet, heavier, more deliberate, like the hush that precedes either surrender or revolution. Marina spent Monday alone in the closed bookshop, surrounded by inventory she couldn't sell and violations she couldn't afford to fix, trying to decide whether the story ended here or whether she had enough fight left for another chapter. The answer came Tuesday morning in the form of Senora Rodriguez, who arrived with news and a thermos of coffee that suggested she intended to stay regardless of official closure notices. "They released him yesterday," she said without preamble. "Professor Santos. 72 hours exactly, clean bill of mental health, list of social services he's supposedly required to utilize." Marina felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. Where is he? That's the question, isn't it? Senora Rodriguez settled into the chair behind the counter as if she belonged there. "The shelters are full, the waiting lists are months long, and the new, pedestrian improvements have made his usual corner uninhabitable for anyone seeking actual shelter." She paused to pour coffee into 2 cups, the domestic gesture transforming the closed bookshop into something that felt alive again. But there are other corners. Other doorways. Other neighborhoods where people understand that progress shouldn't require erasing inconvenient humanity. Marina accepted the coffee gratefully, feeling warmth spread through her hands and into her chest. And the community that formed around him? Still forming. Just in different places around different needs. Senora Rodriguez smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had discovered an unexpected truth. Turns out resistance is contagious. Once people remember they have power to choose kindness over compliance, they start looking for other opportunities to make that choice. As if summoned by their conversation, the bookshop door chimed and Padre Miguel entered, followed by 3 of the university students who had maintained vigil on the sidewalk. Behind them came Dona Rosa with her knitting, and behind her a handful of faces Marina recognized from the neighborhood but had never spoken with directly. "We've been thinking," Padre Miguel announced, surveying the officially closed space with the calm authority of someone accustomed to working within and around bureaucratic restrictions. "About books and community, and what it means to create spaces where people can afford to remain human." One of the students, the young woman who had spoken about Gabriel's influence on her education, stepped forward with the intensity of someone who had discovered a calling. What if the bookshop doesn't need to be a bookshop to serve its community? What if it could be something else? A space for literacy programs, community meetings, mutual aid coordination. "The violations specifically target retail operations," another student added, producing a folder of documents. "But they don't prohibit educational or charitable activities." Different regulations, different bureaucratic pathways. Marina stared at the group assembling in her closed bookshop, feeling the first stirrings of something that might have been hope. You're talking about transformation, not just preservation. We're talking about evolution, Padre Miguel corrected gently. About letting the community's needs determine what this space becomes, rather than letting bureaucratic pressure determine what it can't be. Dona Rosa looked up from her knitting with the practical wisdom of someone who had survived 8 decades of social change. Books are just tools for sharing stories. Community is just people choosing to care about each other. The form matters less than the function. Over the following hours, Marina watched her closed bookshop transform into something she had never imagined, a planning center for neighborhood organization, a resource-sharing hub, a place where people came not just to buy books but to discuss what kind of community they wanted to build together. Students researched legal frameworks for community centers and educational cooperatives. Padre Miguel contacted church networks that provided support for grassroots organizing. Senora Rodriguez mapped informal networks of mutual aid that already existed but had never been formally connected. By evening, they had outlined a plan that was audacious in its simplicity. Rather than fighting to preserve what existed, they would create something new that served the community's actual needs while operating within legal structures that offered better protection from bureaucratic harassment. The bookshop would become a community literacy center, offering tutoring for children, ESL classes for immigrants, job training for unemployed adults. The book inventory would become a lending library supplemented by donations and grants. The small space would host neighborhood meetings, support groups, cultural events. And Gabriel? Marina asked as the group prepared to leave. We'll always have a place here when he needs one, Padre Miguel answered. Not as charity case or political symbol, but as community member whose presence is valued regardless of his housing status. After everyone left, Marina stood alone in the space that had been her workplace and was becoming something entirely different. The official closure notices still hung on the walls, the regulatory violations still demanded impossible remedies, the bureaucratic machinery still ground forward with its inexorable logic. But something had shifted in the fundamental equation. Instead of defending existing arrangements against hostile change, they were now actively creating new arrangements that served human needs more effectively than the old ones ever had. The transformation felt less like surrender and more like strategic advancement, not abandoning their values but finding better ways to express them, not accepting defeat but redefining victory to match their actual objectives rather than their opponents' assumptions about what they were fighting to preserve. As Marina locked the door and walked home through streets that no longer felt entirely hostile, she realized that Gabriel's quiet presence on her corner had accomplished something none of them had anticipated. It had revealed a community's capacity to choose love over fear when given the opportunity to do so collectively rather than in isolation. The story wasn't ending. It was just beginning a new chapter. 3 months later, the former bookshop hummed with activity that would have been unimaginable during its quiet days as a retail operation. The morning literacy program filled the space with children's voices as volunteers helped them navigate picture books and beginning readers. Afternoon brought adult students practicing English conversation, their careful pronunciation mixing with the soft rustle of donated clothing being sorted for the weekly distribution. Marina moved through the transformed space with the fluid efficiency of someone who had discovered work that matched her deepest convictions. No longer constrained by profit margins and inventory management, she found herself coordinating programs that addressed needs she had only glimpsed during her years behind the bookshop counter. The regulatory battles had ended not with victory or defeat but with irrelevance. The Community Literacy Center operated under different rules, funded by grants and donations rather than retail sales, supported by volunteer networks rather than individual employment. The bureaucratic weapons designed to strangle small businesses proved ineffective against an organization that wasn't trying to make money, only to serve human needs. Gabriel had returned to the neighborhood 2 weeks after the center opened, but not to his old corner. Instead, he appeared one morning as part of the adult literacy program, offering to help immigrants navigate employment applications and housing paperwork. His presence felt natural, integrated, not the solitary figure requiring charity but a community member contributing skills developed during years of navigating bureaucratic systems designed to exclude people like him. The university wants to interview him, announced Dr. Carvalho, the education professor who coordinated the center's academic programs. Feature story about faculty resilience, rehabilitation, second chances. They want to present him as success story for their alumni magazine. Marina looked across the room where Gabriel sat patiently helping an elderly woman fill out Social Security forms, his voice carrying the same gentle authority she remembered from their early morning conversations. "What does he think about that?" He declined. Said his value to this community isn't as symbol of individual redemption but as person doing useful work alongside other people doing useful work. Dr. Carvalho smiled. He suggested they write about the community instead of about him. The community had indeed become worth writing about. The success of the Literacy Center had inspired similar transformations throughout the neighborhood. A closed laundromat became a tool-lending library where people could borrow equipment for home repairs. An abandoned lot became a community garden where families grew vegetables and children learned about nutrition. A struggling bakery partnered with the center to provide job training for people transitioning out of homelessness. The changes weren't dramatic enough to attract media attention or political credit, but they were substantial enough to alter daily life for hundreds of people. Children who had struggled with reading now helped younger students. Adults who had felt isolated by language barriers joined conversation groups that became friendship networks. Elderly residents who had rarely left their apartments began volunteering for programs that made them feel needed and valued. Dante Ashford reappeared on a Tuesday afternoon in late spring, entering the center with the careful neutrality of someone visiting enemy territory. Marina hadn't seen him since Gabriel's forced removal, but his presence still carried the same calculated authority, the same assumption that his perspective deserved consideration regardless of context. "Impressive transformation," he said, surveying the bustling activity with what might have been genuine admiration. "You've created something here that serves genuine community needs." "We've created something here that serves the community that was already here," Marina corrected. "Instead of trying to replace it with something more profitable." "About that." Dante positioned himself where they could speak privately while still observing the center's activities. "I wanted you to know that the development project has been modified. The investors have decided to focus on commercial spaces rather than residential displacement. The neighborhood will see new businesses, but existing residents won't be forced out." Marina studied his expression, looking for the calculation behind this apparent concession. "And why are you telling me this?" "Because you demonstrated something the investors hadn't anticipated, that community resistance could be creative rather than just obstructive. That people committed to staying in their neighborhood might also be committed to improving it in ways that benefit everyone." He gestured toward the center's programs. "This kind of grassroots development actually enhances property values while preserving neighborhood character. It creates the kind of community stability that makes long-term investment more attractive, not less." Marina realized she was hearing the logic of someone who had learned to incorporate opposition into strategy rather than simply overcome it. "You're saying our resistance has been absorbed into your plans." "I'm saying your resistance created possibilities neither side had imagined when we started fighting about one man's right to sit on a public corner." Dante's expression carried something that might have been respect. Sometimes the most effective victories are the ones that transform conflict into collaboration. After he left, Marina stood in the center watching Gabriel help a teenager with college application essays while Donna Rosa taught knitting to a group of young mothers. The scene felt both revolutionary and completely ordinary, people taking care of each other in ways that strengthened the whole community rather than just serving individual needs. Had they won or lost their battle against displacement and bureaucratic cruelty? The question felt less important than it once had. They had created something worth defending, something that served human needs more effectively than what they had been trying to preserve. Whether that qualified as victory depended on how you measured success, by what you prevented or by what you made possible. That evening, as Marina prepared to close the center, she found Gabriel shelving donated books in the small library section they had created near the front window. He worked with the same careful attention she remembered from his solitary mornings on the corner, but his movements now carried the satisfaction of someone whose presence was valued rather than merely tolerated. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked. "The teaching, the university, the life you had before?" Gabriel looked up from the books he was organizing, considering the question with characteristic thoughtfulness. "I miss the illusion that individual achievement could insulate me from collective vulnerability. But I don't miss the isolation that came with believing I was responsible only for my own success." He gestured toward the center around them, still humming with quiet activity as the day's programs wound down. "This feels more like education than anything I did in a classroom. More like community than anything I experienced as a professor." Marina nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. The center had taught all of them that security came not from individual preparation for disaster but from collective commitment to ensuring everyone's needs were met. That dignity wasn't something you earned through achievement but something you claimed by remaining human regardless of circumstances. As she locked the door and walked home through streets that now felt genuinely safe, not because threats had disappeared but because people knew how to respond to them together, Marina realized that Gabriel's quiet presence on her corner had accomplished something none of them had anticipated. It had revealed a community's capacity to transform crisis into opportunity, resistance into creation, individual kindness into collective power. The story that had begun with one woman bringing water to a thirsty man had become something larger, a neighborhood's discovery that they could build the world they wanted to live in, one act of practical solidarity at a time.